It was supposed to be a quiet, simple day for Captain Maya Brooks. No flashing lights, no reports to file, no uniform, just her, enjoying a break from the long hours of her demanding job. Today, she was just Maya, blending into the crowd, walking among the people as any other person would. She didn't need to show her badge, didn't need to stand out. She wore plain clothes, her badge tucked away at home. And for once, she felt a bit of freedom from her everyday responsibilities. But there was something about Maya Brooks that naturally set her apart. Even without the badge or the formal attire, she had a presence. It was an aura that came with her years of experience and responsibility. A calm confidence that radiated without her trying. She knew how to carry herself with grace, with authority, yet without the need to prove anything. People who looked at her might have noticed something. Perhaps a subtle strength in her posture, or a quiet awareness in her eyes. But to most people passing by, she was just another woman out for a stroll, and that was exactly how she liked it. However, for Officer Jake Larson, that's all he chose to see. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, just another person walking on his street. Jake was on duty, dressed in his own uniform, carrying himself with the confidence that came from the badge on his chest. He was a man who took his job seriously, but perhaps a bit too seriously at times, especially when it came to judging people based on appearances alone. Jake liked to feel in control, to be the one calling the shots, and he enjoyed the power that came with his position. Today, his attention had landed on Maya, and he couldn't look away. Something about her made him curious. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something that made him feel uncomfortable without him even realizing why. As Maya continued walking, she sensed his eyes on her. It wasn't just a casual glance. It was a watchful, assessing stare, as if he was sizing her up, trying to figure her out. She could feel his gaze following her, lingering longer than it should have, but she brushed it off at first. She was used to being watched in her line of work, used to people noticing her and trying to read her. She was good at keeping her cool, at ignoring unnecessary attention, especially when she was just trying to have a peaceful day off. Yet, something about this situation felt different. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a casual look from an officer on patrol. Jake's gaze was intense, sharp, almost as if he was searching for something wrong with her, some reason to question her. Maya kept her expression calm, her footsteps steady, but inside, she was starting to feel a sense of unease. She knew this type of look too well, had seen it directed at herself and others before. An assumption, a judgment that had no reason behind it other than someone's snap decision based on appearance. Jake finally took a step closer, his hand moving to his belt where his radio rested. The motion was small but unmistakable, a signal that he was getting ready for some kind of interaction. Maya watched him out of the corner of her eye, still walking forward, trying to hold on to the last bits of peace she had planned for the day. But the moment was here. Something was coming, and she could feel it building in the air, as certain as the tension she now felt in her chest. Maya took a breath, reminding herself to stay calm. She didn't want a confrontation. Didn't want to reveal who she was, didn't want to create a scene. She was simply enjoying her day off, just like any other person. But she also knew that situations like these could go in unexpected directions. She knew all too well how quickly things could escalate when someone with authority decided to push a little too hard, and she prepared herself for whatever came next. Officer Larson took a couple more steps toward her, and finally he called out, "Excuse me, ma'am." Maya stopped, turning to face him, her expression neutral. She looked directly at him, her eyes calm but focused, giving him no reason to think she was intimidated. In her line of work, she had encountered countless officers just like him. Quick to assume, quick to judge. She knew how to handle herself in these situations, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions either. Maybe he had a valid reason for approaching her, though she doubted it. Maya stayed silent, waiting for him to speak. Jake cleared his throat, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked her up and down. "Can I ask what you're doing around here?" There it was, the assumption, the question that carried an edge of suspicion. Maya had been expecting it, yet it still irritated her, though she kept her calm. She decided to keep her answers short and simple, giving him no extra reason to pry. "Just walking, officer. Enjoying the day." Jake didn't seem satisfied with her answer. He shifted his stance, crossing his arms in front of him, his expression hardening. "This area doesn't usually see many strangers. You don't look familiar around here." The way he said it, the tone he used, it was all too familiar to Maya. She had seen this happen to people time and again, this subtle but clear message that they didn't belong. Maya held his gaze steadily, keeping her voice polite but firm. "Is there a reason I should need permission to be here?" Jake's face registered a flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected her to respond with such confidence. For a moment, he hesitated, as if trying to decide his next move, but then he seemed to gather himself, his tone taking on an authoritative edge. "Look, I'm just trying to do my job. I need to make sure everything's in order around here." Maya felt her patience thinning, but she kept her expression calm. She didn't need to argue with him, didn't need to prove anything. Still, she knew this interaction was headed somewhere, and there was a choice to be made. She could end it here, walk away, keep her true identity a secret. But part of her wondered if this was a moment to stand her ground, to let him see the reality of who he was dealing with. This officer, so quick to judge, had no idea he was speaking to someone far above his rank, someone who understood his world better than he did. She could see it in his eyes, the assumption, the quiet belief that he was in charge of this situation. And maybe he felt a little thrill in it, a small satisfaction in the power he thought he held over her. But Maya knew the truth. She knew the balance of power was not what he thought. And while she was willing to stay quiet for now, there was a line he was close to crossing. And if he did, he would discover just how wrong his assumptions were. For now, she chose to let the moment sit, allowing him the chance to decide his next move. But deep down, she knew that if he kept pushing, she was ready. She was prepared for what came next, because Maya Brooks was not just any person walking the street. And as he stared at her, still waiting for her to explain herself, she felt the quiet strength of her position settle within her, a reminder of the authority she held, hidden but undeniable. Officer Jake Larson prided himself on what he liked to call keeping the streets safe. For him, this meant being constantly on alert, eyes wide open for anyone who seemed out of place or who didn't fit his idea of what belonged in his neighborhood. In his mind, he was a guardian, someone who looked out for any hint of trouble, ready to jump in at the first sign of anything that seemed off. But Jake's idea of safety wasn't the same for everyone. His approach to the job was often selective, and his judgment was based more on his personal views than on any real evidence of danger. He liked to feel in control, to feel that he was the one deciding who should and shouldn't be in the area. Jake's respect for others was often conditional. It depended on how well they fit into his image of the neighborhood and how much they seemed to respect him in return. He wanted people to know that he was the one in charge, that he had the authority, and that they were, in some way, subject to his approval. But this need for respect was complicated. He only truly offered it to people who already seemed to meet his unspoken standards, people he felt were like him. To those who didn't meet these standards, he acted with suspicion, often taking their mere presence as a reason for questioning or confrontation. Today, his target was Maya. Jake didn't know her, didn't know anything about her story or her position, and certainly didn't know she was an off-duty police captain who had likely seen and experienced more on the job than he had. To him, she was just another woman walking through what he saw as his area. From a distance, Maya looked like an outsider, someone who didn't fit his idea of who should be there. He couldn't put a finger on it, but something about her presence felt like a challenge to his authority, something that nagged at his sense of control. Jake approached her, his steps filled with confidence. His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down, assessing her in a way that felt less like genuine concern and more like judgment. His mind was already jumping to conclusions, forming assumptions based solely on the fact that she looked different to him. And the more he looked, the more his suspicions grew, not because of anything Maya was doing, but because of his own need to feel in charge. As he got closer, he called out, "Excuse me, ma'am. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" His tone was not warm or friendly. Instead, it was heavy with an unspoken assumption. It wasn't a genuine request to check if she was okay or if she needed help. No, this was something else. His words, though polite on the surface, carried an edge of accusation, as if he had already decided she had done something wrong. Maya stopped walking, turning to face him with a calm expression. She met his eyes directly, her face showing neither fear nor surprise. She'd been in situations like this before and knew better than to react impulsively. Her years of experience had taught her the importance of staying calm and composed, of not giving anyone more than they needed to see. She took a breath, keeping her voice steady as she responded. "What's this about, officer?" Her tone was polite, her words simple, but Jake didn't seem to appreciate it. Her calmness seemed to throw him off, as if he'd expected her to be nervous or apologetic. Instead, she stood there with a quiet strength that made him uneasy. His eyes narrowed further as he looked at her, studying her face, trying to find something to confirm the assumptions he had already made in his mind. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice taking on a sharper tone. "You seem out of place." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Out of place. It was a phrase that said so much without saying much at all. It was a phrase she'd heard before, a phrase that carried layers of judgment and exclusion. It was clear that, to Jake, she didn't fit. He couldn't explain why, and perhaps he didn't even think he needed to. But in his mind, she was in the wrong simply by being there. Maya noticed his hand hovering over his radio, a small but unmistakable gesture that said he was ready to call for backup if necessary. It wasn't a big movement, but to someone like Maya, who had trained eyes and years of experience, it was all too familiar. She knew what it meant, knew what it implied. She had seen this before, too many times, both on the job and in her own life. She could see that Jake was prepared to escalate things if she didn't respond the way he wanted. But Maya didn't let it get to her. She stayed calm, her face revealing nothing. She had faced situations like this countless times, had dealt with people who saw only what they wanted to see, people who acted out of assumptions and biases without ever realizing it. She knew how to handle it, knew how to keep her composure, and she wasn't about to give Jake the reaction he was looking for. Jake continued, as if trying to provoke a response from her. "It's just that this area is pretty quiet. We don't get a lot of people passing through who we don't know," he said, his tone attempting to sound friendly but failing. It was clear he was waiting for an explanation, something that would justify her presence to him. But Maya could see through it all. She understood that his need for answers had less to do with safety and more to do with control. He wanted to feel that he was the one in charge, that he could determine who belonged and who didn't. Maya took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. She didn't want to give him more fuel, didn't want to react in a way that might escalate things. "I'm just taking a walk, officer. That's all," she said, her voice calm and steady. She met his eyes with a look that was neither defiant nor submissive, simply neutral. But her response didn't seem to satisfy Jake. He crossed his arms in front of him, his posture becoming more rigid. It was as if he saw her calmness as a challenge, as if her lack of fear or nervousness only made him more suspicious. To him, her refusal to seem intimidated was unexpected, and it didn't fit the image he had created in his mind. He seemed frustrated, as if he'd expected her to act in a way that would make it easier for him to justify his suspicions. Jake cleared his throat, shifting slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. "You don't look familiar around here," he said, his voice carrying an accusatory edge. It was almost as if he was searching for an excuse to question her further, looking for something, anything, that would give him a reason to assert his authority. But Maya didn't waver. She kept her gaze steady, her expression calm. giving him no reason to doubt her words. She knew exactly what he was doing, and she wasn't about to let him dictate her actions or make her feel like she needed to explain herself. She had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of acting as if she had. Jake, however, wasn't ready to give up. He continued watching her, as if waiting for her to break, waiting for her to show some sign of weakness or guilt. But Maya didn't break. She stood there with a quiet strength, allowing him to dig himself deeper into the assumptions he had made, knowing that each word he spoke was only revealing more about his own bias and need for control. For now, Maya stayed silent, letting him decide his next move. She knew she held the real power here, even if he couldn't see it yet. Over the next few minutes, Jake kept his questions coming, each one more probing and unnecessary than the last. He asked where she was from, why she was there, where she was going, and who she was meeting. The questions didn't seem to have any real purpose, except maybe to make her feel uncomfortable, to put her in a position where she had to explain herself. Each question felt like a test, a way to get her to slip up or reveal something that could justify his suspicions. But Maya knew this game well. She'd seen it played too many times before. Maya answered each question with calm, patience, and just enough detail to keep Jake from thinking she was being evasive. She kept her voice steady and her tone polite, even though she could feel a fire growing inside her. She wasn't someone who got flustered easily, but that didn't mean she didn't feel the frustration. Each question, each look, each judgmental tone, it all stirred a quiet anger within her. Still, she kept it hidden, her face calm, her responses neutral. She refused to let him see that he was getting to her, refused to give him the satisfaction of thinking he had rattled her. The more he questioned her, the more he revealed about himself. Every word he spoke, every pointed look, every little smirk, they all told her something about him. His questions weren't about keeping the area safe. They were about control, about power. He wasn't interested in her answers, only in asserting his own authority. He was so sure that he was in charge, so confident that he had the right to demand answers without reason. It didn't matter to him that she was minding her own business, that she hadn't done anything to warrant his attention. To him, her presence was enough reason to stop her, to question her, to make her feel as though she didn't belong. But Maya knew better. She had been in these situations before, had dealt with people who made assumptions, who believed they had the right to judge and question simply because they wore a badge. She had dealt with officers who thought that power came from a uniform, that authority was something you demanded instead of something you earned. She knew that real power didn't need to be shown off, didn't need to be proven. And so she waited, watching him, letting him dig himself deeper into his own arrogance. She waited like a chess player, watching as each move he made put him closer to a position he couldn't escape. As Jake grew bolder, his voice grew louder, his tone sharper. He started to lean in closer, his expression filled with an almost smug satisfaction. To him, this was just another routine interaction, another reminder of his authority. But as he continued, a few passers-by began to slow down, their attention caught by the interaction. Some of them looked at Maya with concern, others with irritation, clearly wondering why this officer was treating a woman so calmly walking through the area like a suspect. A few whispered to each other, exchanging glances that showed their discomfort with the scene unfolding in front of them. One person, standing a bit closer than the others, leaned toward his friend and whispered, "Does he even know who she is?" The question caught Maya's attention, though she didn't react outwardly. She knew that some people in the area recognized her, knew who she really was. They knew she wasn't just an ordinary person walking the street. They knew her as Captain Maya Brooks, a respected figure who held a position of authority, a position that far outranked Jake's. But Maya didn't turn to acknowledge the whispers, didn't give Jake any hint that he was dealing with someone far above his rank. She stayed quiet, watching him, letting him continue, letting him show everyone around exactly who he was and how he treated people based on his assumptions. Jake ignored the looks and whispers, too focused on his own questions to notice how people were starting to see him. He didn't realize how his actions were beginning to backfire, how the scene he was creating was quickly turning against him. To him, the people watching were just part of the background, unimportant to what he saw as his duty. He didn't see their raised eyebrows, their uncomfortable glances, their silent judgment. He was too wrapped up in his own perception of control, too sure that he had the right to question her without reason, too certain that he was untouchable. But Maya could feel the shift in the air. She could sense the moment approaching when the truth would come to light, when Jake would have no choice but to face the reality of who she was. She felt a calm confidence growing within her, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his arrogance would soon be his undoing. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to push back. She only needed to wait, to let him keep talking, to let him reveal more and more of his own flaws. Jake continued with his questions, each one more disrespectful than the last, his tone growing almost mocking as he prodded her for answers. He didn't know that he was sealing his own fate with every word, that the tables were slowly, steadily turning against him. Maya stood there, unmoved, watching him as he unraveled, letting him show everyone exactly who he was without needing to lift a finger. For Maya, this was a moment of quiet victory. She knew that when the time came, she would reveal her true identity, and in that moment, everything would change. Maya stood quietly as Officer Jake Larson continued his barrage of questions. Each question felt more unnecessary, more disrespectful, and more frustrating than the last. She had been patient, letting him speak, letting him dig himself into a hole he wasn't even aware of. She had tried to keep calm, tried to remind herself that this was just a misguided officer doing what he thought was his job. But her patience was wearing thin. Her sense of justice, the very thing that had led her to become a police officer in the first place, was now pushing her to put an end to his behavior. Finally, after one particularly condescending comment from Jake about how people like her didn't usually walk around here, Maya's patience snapped. She took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment she had been waiting for. It was time to end this interaction in a way that would leave no doubt in his mind, or in the minds of the onlookers, about who she truly was and the power she held. This was a moment not just to defend herself, but to show him and everyone watching that respect and authority were earned, not demanded. Jake noticed her reaching into her bag, and for a brief moment, he looked almost triumphant, as if he thought he'd finally forced her to produce her ID and explain herself. But Maya wasn't reaching for a simple ID. She was reaching for something with much more significance, something that would change this entire interaction in an instant. Her fingers closed around her badge, the weight of it familiar and comforting in her hand. Slowly, she lifted it out of her bag. The polished badge glinted in the sunlight, catching Jake's eye. At first, he didn't seem to understand what he was looking at. His expression remained smug, his confidence unshaken. But as Maya held the badge higher, letting the insignia reflect the light more clearly, the reality began to dawn on him. The confident smirk on his face began to fade, replaced by a look of confusion and surprise. "Officer Larson," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "I believe it's time you learned who I am." She paused for effect, letting her words sink in, watching as the last traces of his arrogance faded. She could see the gears turning in his mind, the slow realization spreading across his face. "Captain Maya Brooks," she continued, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Your superior." Jake's face drained of color. The shock was clear in his wide eyes, his parted lips. For a moment he stood frozen, as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at the badge in her hand, then back at her face, his expression a mixture of disbelief and panic. Maya watched him with a calm, steady gaze. She didn't need to say anything else. The truth of her authority was now as clear as day. But she held her hand up, stopping any attempt he might make to recover, to apologize, or to explain himself. She didn't want excuses. She didn't want him to try to backtrack or justify his behavior. She wanted him to understand the full weight of his actions, to feel the embarrassment and regret that came from realizing how completely he had misjudged the situation. Jake finally managed to stammer out a few words, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't. I'm sorry, Captain, I didn't know. Maya raised an eyebrow, her expression unwavering. You didn't know because you didn't take a moment to look beyond your assumptions, she replied, her voice firm but controlled. You judged me without reason, Officer Larson. You questioned me, harassed me, and treated me with disrespect because you assumed I didn't belong here. The crowd that had gathered around them watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of shock, curiosity, and satisfaction. Some of them exchanged glances, clearly pleased to see the tables turn. They had seen the way Jake had treated her, had witnessed his arrogance and judgment, and now they were witnessing his downfall. Jake swallowed hard, his face still pale, his hands fidgeting nervously. He seemed completely at a loss for words, his usual confidence shattered. He was no longer the one in control, no longer the one with authority. Now he stood before her, exposed and vulnerable, his actions laid bare for everyone to see. Maya kept her gaze steady, not allowing him even a moment of comfort. I am a police captain, Officer Larson, she continued, her voice carrying a quiet strength. I have dedicated years of my life to this job, to serving and protecting, to upholding justice, and that includes holding officers like you accountable when they let their biases affect their judgment. Jake tried to speak again, his voice barely more than a mumble. Captain Brooks, I didn't mean to. I just thought. You just thought that I didn't belong, she interrupted, her tone sharper now. You didn't see a person, Officer Larson. You saw an outsider, someone you decided was suspicious without any reason. You abused your position, and you let your personal biases cloud your duty. The onlookers murmured softly, nodding in agreement with her words. They had seen everything, had witnessed the way Jake had treated her, and now they were seeing the consequences of his actions. Maya could feel their support, their silent encouragement, and it strengthened her resolve to continue. This job is about serving the public, Maya went on, her voice calm but unyielding. It's about respect, fairness, and justice. If you can't treat people with respect, if you can't see beyond your own assumptions, then you have no business wearing that badge. Jake looked down, unable to meet her gaze, his face flushed with shame. He seemed to shrink under the weight of her words, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by a look of regret and humiliation. He knew he had crossed a line, knew that he had failed in his duty, and now he was facing the consequences. From this moment forward, Maya said, her tone leaving no room for argument, you are under review. I will be filing a formal report on this incident, and Internal Affairs will be looking into your conduct. You will be held accountable for every decision you made here today, every word you spoke, every judgment you passed without cause. Jake's shoulders slumped, his face a picture of defeat. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper as he replied, Yes, Captain. I understand. Maya held his gaze for a moment longer, making sure he felt the full weight of her authority. She wanted him to remember this moment, to understand that his actions had consequences, that his behavior would not go unchallenged. And she wanted him to realize that respect and authority were earned, not demanded or assumed. Finally, she took a step back, allowing him a moment to collect himself. She looked around at the crowd, her eyes meeting those of the onlookers who had witnessed everything. Some of them smiled at her, nodding in quiet approval, grateful to see justice served, even in this small but significant way. Maya took one last look at Jake, her expression firm and unyielding. Let this be a lesson, Officer Larson, she said. Treat people with respect. Do your job with integrity. And remember that authority comes with responsibility. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, surrounded by the murmurs of the crowd. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked, a mixture of admiration and respect following her. And she knew that she had done the right thing, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced a situation like this, for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. As she left the scene, she felt a sense of satisfaction, a feeling of justice served. She had stood up, not just for herself, but for everyone watching, for everyone who had been in her position. And she knew that Officer Larson would remember this day, that he would think twice before making another judgment based solely on his assumptions. Sometimes, justice wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes, it was about small, quiet victories, about standing firm in the face of prejudice, about showing people that respect and dignity were more powerful than any badge. And Maya Brooks, police captain and proud defender of justice, had done just that. Maya's expression was unflinching as she clipped her badge to her belt, the emblem of her authority now clear for everyone to see. She looked directly at Officer Jake Larson, her eyes steady and her voice as firm as steel. "Your conduct today was unprofessional, biased, and unacceptable," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This isn't the kind of department I run, Officer Larson. The behavior you showed today does not represent what we stand for. You can expect to hear from internal affairs by the end of the day." The crowd that had gathered to watch the scene was silent at first, their attention focused entirely on Jake, who now looked stunned, almost frozen in place. Just moments before, he had carried himself with arrogance, certain of his control over the situation. Now, with his confidence shattered and his power stripped away, he was left exposed, unsure of how to respond. He stammered, searching for words, his face red with embarrassment and regret. He had started this day with the intention of keeping his streets safe, but his actions had taken him down a path he hadn't anticipated, a path that led him right into a confrontation with his own captain. As he stammered, unable to find a coherent response, Maya remained calm, watching him with a steady gaze. She could see the mixture of confusion and shame on his face, could see that he was beginning to understand the depth of his mistake. But she didn't offer him any comfort, didn't soften her words or give him an easy way out. She wanted him to fully feel the impact of his actions, to understand the consequences of his judgments and assumptions. Around them, the crowd began to murmur, voices rising in quiet approval and satisfaction. Some people exchanged glances, nodding to each other, clearly pleased to see justice served. They had seen the way Jake had treated her, had witnessed his arrogance and his lack of respect, and now they were seeing him face the consequences of his actions. The murmurs grew louder, and Maya could feel the support of the people around her, the silent encouragement that came from those who had seen the truth and stood with her. Jake shifted uncomfortably, taking a small step back, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. He looked around, noticing the crowd for the first time, realizing that his behavior had not only been exposed, but had also been judged by everyone who had witnessed it. He cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean any harm, Captain. I thought I was just doing my job." Maya raised an eyebrow, her gaze unyielding. "Doing your job," she repeated, her voice filled with quiet strength. "Your job is to serve and protect, to treat everyone with respect and fairness. What you did today was neither of those things. Instead of treating me as a fellow citizen, you treated me with suspicion, with disrespect, simply because you made an assumption." Jake swallowed hard, his face turning a deeper shade of red. I didn't know who you were." Maya shook her head, her expression firm. "It shouldn't matter who I am," she said. "Every person you encounter deserves respect, whether they wear a badge or not. You let your own biases control your actions today, Officer Larson, and that is unacceptable in this department." Jake looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumping. He had no defense, no justification that could excuse his behavior. He knew he had crossed a line, and now he was facing the full weight of that realization. The crowd watched, their attention fixed on him, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and quiet judgment. Maya continued, her voice carrying a sense of authority that left no room for argument. "From this moment on, Your actions today will be reviewed by internal affairs. They will look at every decision you made, every word you spoke, every assumption you allowed to cloud your judgment. You will be held accountable, Officer Larson. Jake's face was a mask of regret and shame, his hands fidgeting at his sides as he tried to process the weight of her words. He had always prided himself on his authority, on his ability to control situations and make decisions. But today, that authority had been stripped away, and he was left with the uncomfortable truth of his own actions. He had not only failed in his duty, but had also betrayed the very values he claimed to uphold. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and Maya could hear snippets of conversations around her. It's about time someone stood up to him. One person whispered to their friend. Serves him right, another muttered, nodding in agreement. Maya felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had not only defended herself, but had also shown everyone watching that justice could and would be served, even when the wrongdoer was one of their own. She hadn't planned for this confrontation, hadn't wanted it, but now that it had happened, she was determined to see it through to the end. Turning her attention back to Jake, she spoke again, her voice softer but no less firm. This department is built on trust, on respect, on fairness. If you can't uphold those values, then you have no place here. Jake nodded slowly, his face still pale, his hands shaking slightly. He looked like he wanted to say something, perhaps to defend himself, to offer some kind of excuse. But he remained silent, realizing that nothing he could say would change the facts of what he had done. He had allowed his own biases to control his actions, had let his assumptions cloud his judgment, and now he was facing the consequences. Thank you for your time, Captain, he finally managed to say, his voice barely more than a whisper. I'll reflect on what you said. Maya watched him for a moment, her expression unreadable. She didn't offer him forgiveness or sympathy, only a silent acknowledgement of his words. She wanted him to remember this moment, to carry it with him as a lesson, a reminder of what it truly meant to serve and protect. With a final nod, Maya turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing alone, surrounded by the quiet murmur of the crowd. She didn't look back, didn't need to see his face again. She knew that he had been changed by this experience, that he would think twice before letting his biases dictate his actions in the future. As she walked, Maya felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of justice served. She knew that her actions had not only defended her own dignity, but had also sent a message to everyone watching. Authority was not a tool for control or judgment. It was a responsibility, a duty to treat everyone with fairness and respect. The crowd began to disperse, some people nodding at her as she passed, offering quiet gestures of support and admiration. She met their gazes with a small, respectful nod, grateful for their silent acknowledgement. They had seen everything, had witnessed the truth of what had happened, and now they understood the importance of standing up against injustice, even in small moments like these. For Maya, this moment was a victory not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment, for everyone who had been judged based on appearance or assumption. She knew that the path to true justice was paved with moments like these, moments where people stood firm, spoke up, and refused to be silenced. As she left the scene, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper commitment to her role as a leader and a protector. She knew that her job was not just about enforcing the law. It was about setting an example, about showing others the power of fairness and respect. And today, she had done just that, not only for herself, but for everyone watching. In the end, justice was not about power or control. It was about doing what was right, even when it was difficult. And Maya Brooks, police captain and proud defender of justice, had shown everyone that true authority was not about who had the badge, but about who had the courage to stand for what was right. As Maya walked away from the scene, she felt a deep sense of purpose returning to her. The weight of her position, the responsibility she carried, and the importance of her role as a leader in law enforcement settled back on her shoulders. It was a weight she carried with pride, one she had earned through years of hard work, dedication, and countless moments like this, moments that tested her patience, her values, and her commitment to justice. She could still feel the lingering emotions from the encounter. She had stayed calm and composed, but the exchange with Officer Jake Larson had stirred up feelings that went far beyond this single interaction. This wasn't the first time she had faced judgment based on appearance, assumptions, or bias. As a black woman in a position of authority, she was no stranger to the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, challenges that came from people who believed that authority and respect were meant only for certain people, people who fit a certain image. But she had never let that stop her. She had always chosen to meet these challenges with dignity and strength, to show through her actions and her resilience that true power and leadership didn't come from appearances. They came from character and integrity. As she glanced back briefly, her eyes met those of the onlookers who had gathered to watch. She saw a range of emotions on their faces: admiration, respect, and maybe even a bit of awe. Some of them had witnessed the whole thing from the start, had seen how she handled herself, how she had kept calm in the face of unfair treatment, and had ultimately revealed the truth in a way that left no room for doubt about her authority. Their expressions told her that they had been impacted by what they had seen, that they understood the message she had sent without needing her to say it out loud. In that brief moment of connection with the crowd, Maya felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She hadn't just defended herself, she had shown everyone, including Jake, what true strength looked like. She had demonstrated that power wasn't about who could shout the loudest or who wore the uniform. It was about who could remain steady, who could stay true to their values, even when others tried to shake them. Power was about knowing who you were, understanding your purpose, and standing firm in that knowledge, no matter what others might assume. As she continued to walk away, her thoughts drifted to the many people she had met in her career, people who had been judged unfairly, who had been questioned or dismissed simply because of how they looked, where they came from, or because they didn't fit someone else's idea of what belonged. She thought of the countless times she had seen people overlooked, people whose quiet strength went unnoticed, whose voices weren't heard because someone else had decided they didn't matter. Those were the people she had always tried to stand up for, the ones who deserved to be seen, respected, and valued for who they were. In a way, this experience with Jake was a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. She hadn't become a police captain to wield power or to command respect for herself. She had done it to make a difference, to bring fairness, respect, and justice to every corner of her community. She knew that her role wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about setting an example, showing others that true authority came from integrity, empathy, and a commitment to doing what was right. She wanted people to look at her and see not just a captain, but a leader who stood for something larger than herself, someone who believed in the power of fairness and respect for all. As Maya walked further, she thought about the lesson she hoped Officer Larson would take from this. She had left him with a lot to think about, and she knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But more than punishment, she hoped that he would reflect on what had happened and understand why his actions had been wrong. She hoped he would come to see that his badge didn't give him the right to judge others based on assumptions, that respect wasn't something he could demand or control. She wanted him to realize that being an officer was a privilege, one that required humility, compassion, and the ability to look past his own biases. If there was one thing Maya had learned in her years of service, it was that authority was a double-edged sword. It could be used to uplift, to protect, and to serve with integrity, or it could be used to intimidate, to control, and to harm. The choice of how to wield that power lay with each individual, and every officer had to decide for themselves what kind of legacy they wanted to leave. Maya had made her choice long ago, and today she had reminded Jake, and everyone watching, that true power lay in using one's position to do good, to treat others with respect, and to challenge injustice wherever it appeared. As she walked, her thoughts turned to her fellow officers, especially the younger ones just starting their careers. She hoped that they would look at her example and understand the importance of humility and respect. She knew that the path wasn't always easy, that it took courage to stand up for what was right, especially in a system that sometimes resisted change. But she also knew that every small act of fairness, every decision to treat someone with kindness, and every refusal to judge based on appearance made a difference. Each of these actions contributed to a culture of respect and justice, one that she had worked hard to build and would continue to uphold. Maya took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs as she continued down the street. She felt a renewed sense of commitment to her role, a reminder of the quiet but powerful impact she could have, not only through her actions, but also through the example she set. She knew that her strength wasn't in loud displays or in asserting her authority for its own sake. It was in the quiet, steady way she carried herself, in the respect she showed others, and in her refusal to let anyone, even a fellow officer, undermine her sense of self-worth. Sometimes, the greatest strength came from the quietest places, from the resilience that others couldn't see, from the courage to stand firm when no one else would. Maya knew that there would always be people like Jake, people who judged based on surface-level impressions, who couldn't see past their own assumptions. But she also knew that for every person like Jake, there were many others who understood, who saw the value of treating others with kindness and respect, who believed in the power of empathy and fairness. As she continued walking, Maya felt a wave of gratitude for all the people who had supported her along the way. Her family, her friends, her mentors, and her community. She knew that she wasn't alone in her journey, that there were countless others who believed in the same values, who stood for justice and respect, and who worked every day to make the world a fairer place. She felt proud to be part of that larger movement, a movement of people who understood that true power didn't come from a badge or a title, but from the integrity with which one lived their life. In the end, Maya's reflection led her to a simple but powerful truth. Respect was something earned, not demanded. Authority could be given, but true leadership came from within, from the way one treated others, from the choices one made, and from the willingness to stand up for what was right. And for those who judged others based solely on appearances, who couldn't see beyond the surface, they were the ones who would never understand the real meaning of strength, the quiet strength that couldn't be seen but could always be felt. Maya knew that her journey was far from over, that there would be more challenges, more moments that tested her resolve. But she also knew that she was ready, that she would continue to walk her path with the same dignity and strength she had shown today. She had learned long ago that the journey toward justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and she was prepared to keep going, one step at a time, confident in the knowledge that every action, every decision, and every moment of quiet strength brought her closer to the world she believed in. As she walked, her mind settled into a feeling of peace, a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew that she had done the right thing, not just for herself, but for everyone watching, for everyone who had ever been in her position. And she knew that the impact of this moment would ripple outward, touching the lives of those who had witnessed it, inspiring them to carry the message forward in their own lives. With each step, Maya Brooks felt a renewed commitment to her role, to her values, and to the people she served. She was more than a captain, more than a badge or a title. She was a leader, a protector, and a voice for justice. And she would continue to be that voice, continue to stand firm in her beliefs, knowing that sometimes the quiet strength people overlooked was the very strength that held the most power.